Hey everyone, and welcome. We're here today thanks to my tax accountant, the UK's leading firm for, well, everything taxes.
That's us. Always happy to shed some light on these, shall we say, complex matters.
And they've brought us together because, let's be honest, the spring statement on March 26th, well, it's going to be a big one. Everyone's wondering how it's going to hit their wallets.
Absolutely. The Chancellor's got a lot on her plate, that's for sure. This spring statement, it's shaping up to be far more than just a routine economic update.
Right, so maybe for folks who haven't been following every twist and turn of the financial news, let's do a quick breakdown. What exactly is this spring statement?
Think of it as the Chancellor's mid-year report card on the UK economy. We'll hear the latest forecasts, the government's take on the challenges, and maybe, just maybe, get some hints about future policy changes.
And this year, those hints might be a bit less subtle than usual, wouldn't you say? I mean, we just came out of a recession, inflation is still a concern, and then there's that looming public finance deficit.
You're hitting all the key points. It's a mixed bag, economically speaking. On the one hand, we are seeing signs of recovery. The projected GDP growth is at 1.7%. Inflation seems to be easing back towards that 2% target, and the Bank of England is even hinting at interest rate cuts.
So that's the good news, but I'm guessing there's a but coming.
Well, the government is still grappling with a 22 billion council buffer. And then, to make matters even more interesting, news just broke that their 9.9 billion financial buffer, it's gone. Completely vanished.
Whoa, okay. A vanished buffer. That's not ideal, to say the least.
It's definitely a curveball. It limits the government's flexibility, puts immense pressure on the Chancellor to really control spending.
So it sounds like Chancellor Reeves is walking a tightrope here. On one side, the need to stimulate growth. On the other, the need to get those finances under control. How's she likely to approach this balancing act?
Well, she's been pretty clear about her three key objectives for this spring statement. First up, boosting economic growth. A stronger economy means more jobs, higher wages, and ultimately more tax revenue for the government to work with.
Makes sense. What's objective number 2?
Keeping inflation under control. It's showing signs of easing, but it's still a major concern. No one wants to see prices constantly going up, eating away at their purchasing power.
Right, and then the less glamorous but equally important objective.
Fiscal discipline. Basically, getting the government's finances back on track, reducing that massive deficit. It's crucial for the long-term health of the UK economy.
Okay, so those are the big picture goals.
Yeah.
But for our listeners, the million-pound question is, how does this translate into actual action? What can we really expect to hear on March 26th?
It's likely we'll hear a range of initiatives aimed at, stimulating that economic growth we were talking about. And it seems the focus will be on encouraging private sector investment.
So if you were a betting person, where would you put your money? Tax breaks for businesses, big infrastructure projects, or something completely out of left field?
I'd say a combination of those first two. We might see reductions in corporation tax to attract businesses and incentivize them to invest. And I think it's a safe bet we'll hear some announcements about infrastructure spending, transport, digital infrastructure, and of course housing. That's always a hot topic.
Housing is huge, especially now. So how might the spring statement impact that market? Those planning reforms we keep hearing about, are those actually going to move the needle?
It's possible. The idea is that if you streamline the planning process, it could lead to faster approvals for new developments. And in theory, that should increase the supply of housing, which eventually could ease prices.
Okay, so there's hope on the horizon.
Yeah.
But let's be realistic. Nobody expects miracles to happen overnight, right? These things take time.
Exactly. And we have to ask, will these new homes be truly affordable for average buyers?
Mm-hmm.
Or are they going to be snapped up by investors, and then we're just fueling that affordability crisis even more?
That's a worry for a lot of people, especially those first-time buyers who are just trying to get a foot on the ladder. It's a tough market out there. But aside from housing, there's another area that's probably going to generate a lot of discussion and anxiety among our listeners.
You're talking about those potential cuts to welfare spending, aren't you?
I am. I mean, it's a tough topic, but we have to address it.
Absolutely. Remember that deficit we talked about? Well, tackling that might require some difficult choices. And welfare spending, it's often seen as a prime target for those cuts.
But these programs, they support millions of people across the UK, many of whom are already dealing with rising costs. It's a delicate situation.
It is. And we'll delve into the specifics a bit later. But suffice it to say, the potential consequences are significant. It's not just about individuals and families. It also impacts the charities and care providers who often step in to fill the gaps when government support is reduced.
Right, so it's a complex web of interconnected issues.
Mm.
So what else should we be listening for on March 26th? What are some of the other key things that could have a big impact?
Well, keep your ears peeled for any mention of adjustments to national insurance contributions. NICs, as they're known.
Yes, NICs. The tax that everyone pays but nobody seems to fully understand.
Exactly. There's a lot of talk about employer NICs specifically. They're due to rise in April, and that has a lot of businesses worried. We might hear about some relief measures, maybe an increase to the employment allowance. That would help smaller businesses offset some of those costs.
Okay, so potentially good news for small businesses and their employees. Anything else to watch out for?
The spring statement is also expected to touch upon the Bank of England's likely interest rate cuts and how that aligns with the government's goals, managing inflation while still supporting growth.
It's always a balancing act, isn't it?
It really is. And then, of course, there's the global economic context. Chancellor Reeves wants to strengthen the UK's position on the world stage, especially with ongoing challenges like those U.S. tariffs. So I wouldn't be surprised if we hear about some new trade agreements, maybe initiatives aimed at attracting foreign investment. It's all about making the UK competitive.
It sounds like there's a lot on the agenda for March 26th. It's going to be a busy day. But let's get down to brass tacks here. What does all of this actually mean for everyday people, for our listeners? Let's start with the housing market. What can people expect?
Okay, let's break that down. So we've talked about these big plans, but how does that actually play out in someone's life? Real world impact.
Right, because it's easy to get lost in those big numbers and policy jargon.
Absolutely. So let's picture someone like, let's say, Jane. Single mom in Bristol, working hard, saving every penny, trying to buy a flat for her and her child. But prices are sky high, right? It feels like an impossible dream for so many.
I think a lot of people listening can relate to Jane's situation. Trying to do everything right, but still feeling priced out of the market.
Exactly. So how could the spring statement actually change things for her? Well, let's imagine those planning reforms actually kick in, streamlining approvals for new developments in her area.
Okay, so more homes get built, more supply. Could that lead to lower prices eventually? Is that the hope?
That's the idea. It might not happen overnight, but gradually that increased supply could ease some of the pressure on prices. Maybe that 200,000 pounds flat Jane's been looking at, maybe in a couple of years it becomes a slightly more attainable 190,000 pounds.
Even that 10,000 pound difference, that could be huge for Jane. A smaller mortgage, lower monthly payments, maybe she can even start putting some money aside for her child's future.
Exactly. And it's not just about individuals like Jane. Remember that construction firm we mentioned, Build Fast Ltd?
Mm-hmm.
If they get the contract to build those new homes, we're talking about increased revenue for them, potentially 1.5 million pounds. And that could mean 100 new jobs.
So more affordable housing A&D, a boost for the construction industry. That's what they call a win-win, right?
Potentially, yes. But of course, we can't forget the other side of this coin. Those potential welfare cuts, they could have a very different impact on people's lives.
Let's talk about that. It's a sensitive subject, but we need to be honest about how those cuts could actually affect real families.
Absolutely. Let's take, for instance, the Wilson family up in Liverpool. The father, he relies on PIP to manage a chronic illness. He gets £150 a week, which is a big chunk of their household budget.
I imagine that money helps them cover the essentials. Food, heating, medical costs, everything adds up.
Exactly. But if those rumors about $5 billion in welfare cuts are true, the Wilsons could see their PIP payments reduced, maybe by as much as 20%. We're talking about a loss of £30 a week, which is £1,560 over the course of a year.
That's a significant hit to their income, especially with the cost of living already so high. It makes you wonder, how would they cope with that kind of shortfall?
It wouldn't be easy. They might have to cut back on things they need, rely more on food banks, or even start falling behind on bills. This is where the spring statement goes beyond just numbers on a spreadsheet and becomes about real-life consequences.
It really highlights those difficult choices the government has to make, and how those choices can have such a different impact on different people. So we've talked about individuals, but what about businesses? How might the spring statement affect, let's say, a small business owner?
Okay, well, let's picture Bean and Brew, a small independent coffee shop in Cardiff. 5 employees, they're doing okay, but like everyone, they're feeling the pressure of rising costs. And those employer NICs, the ones that are due to rise in April, those are a big worry.
I think pretty much every small business owner in the UK is dreading that NIC's hike. It's a big expense.
You're not wrong. For Bean and Brew, that increase would add an extra $828 to their annual costs. Might not sound like a lot, but for a small business operating on tight margins, every pound counts.
Absolutely. So what could the spring statement offer to help businesses like Bean and Brew navigate this?
Well, one possibility is that increase to the employment allowance we talked about earlier. If it goes up to 6,000 pounds, it would completely offset the NIC's increase for a business like Bean and Brew.
That's a big deal. It could be the difference between them just scraping by and actually having some room to breathe, maybe even invest in their business.
Exactly. Let's say Bean and Brew has been thinking about investing in a new, top-of-the-line coffee roaster, a 20,000-pound purchase, which could really improve the quality of their coffee.
That's a smart investment, but a big risk for a small business.
It is. But remember those rumors about full expensing for equipment purchases. What if that comes true? Bean and Brew could deduct the entire cost of that roaster from their taxable profits immediately.
So instead of spreading those deductions out over several years, they get the whole tax benefit up front. That would free up a lot of cash.
Exactly. They could reinvest that money in the business, maybe hire another barista, even think about opening a second location.
So the spring statement could offer some protection from those rising costs, but also a chance to grow. It's a fascinating interplay.
It is. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the finance sector. Interest rate cuts, green finance, new regulations. A lot going on there.
This is where it gets really interesting, right? Because these decisions affect everyone, from homeowners with mortgages to investors looking for opportunities. It's all connected.
You got it. Let's start with interest rates. There's growing speculation that the Bank of England might cut rates in the coming months. For someone like, let's say, John, a teacher in London with a £150,000 mortgage, a rate cut could mean some serious savings on his monthly payments.
Okay, how much are we talking here? Could it actually make a noticeable difference in his life?
Potentially, yes. Even a small cut, say 0.5%, could reduce his monthly payments by about £40. That's an extra £480 each year. Not bad.
That's definitely not something to sneeze at. But what about savers and investors? They're probably not going to be as thrilled about a rate cut, right?
Probably not. Lower rates usually mean lower returns on savings accounts and investments. But here's where it gets interesting. Chancellor Reeves has also hinted at some pretty attractive tax breaks for green investments. So even with lower rates, those tax breaks might entice some savers to shift their money into those types of funds.
So there might be some opportunities for people who want to invest in a way that aligns with their values, with their concern for the environment.
Exactly. Now, on the banking side, those new green finance regulations, they could be a bit of a mixed bag. Banks might face some higher costs as they adapt to the new rules. Think about it. They might have to invest in new systems, hire more compliance staff, and they might even have to turn away business from companies that don't meet those stricter environmental standards.
So there's a potential downside for banks as they navigate these changes.
There is. But it also creates opportunities, right? Banks that can adapt, maybe even specialize in green finance, they could attract a whole new customer base, those people looking for ethical, sustainable investment options.
So it's almost like a push towards a more sustainable finance sector, even if it comes with some growing pains.
You could say that. And let's not forget about Lisa, John's friend, who's been looking for ways to make her portfolio more sustainable. Imagine if she could invest, say, £10,000 in a green fund and get a £500 tax break on top of that.
That's a real incentive. It shows how these spring statement measures can actually influence individual choices, shape entire sectors even.
Absolutely. It's all interconnected.
Yeah.
Now, before we wrap up, there's one more area I think we should touch on, one that often gets overlooked.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What is it?
The impact on charities and the nonprofit sector. They're such a vital part of our society, these charities. They're out there providing essential services, support for millions. But they're often reliant on government funding and donations, both of which could be affected by what comes out on March 26th.
Right, because we were talking about those potential spending cuts. That could trickle down and mean less funding for charities, couldn't it?
It could. And then, if individuals and businesses are feeling squeezed, maybe from tax changes or just the overall economic uncertainty, they might not be as generous with donations. It all adds up.
That's a worry. Charities are already stretched thin as it is, trying to do more with less.
Exactly. In the spring statement, it could put even more pressure on them. Something to keep an eye on, for sure.
It is. So as we get closer to March 26th, It really feels like we're in for a mixed bag, doesn't it? Potential winners and losers in different sectors, at different income levels. It's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
It is. And it's not just about the economic side of things, right? There's the social impact to consider too. These decisions, they're going to shape our communities, our opportunities, how we feel about things in general. It's big.
Absolutely. It goes beyond just the numbers. So as everyone's following the news coverage, digging into those spring statement details, what's your advice? How should people approach this?
Don't just focus on the numbers. Think about the people behind those numbers. Think about families, businesses, communities across the UK. How are these policies actually going to affect them?
It's a call for empathy, isn't it? To really understand the human consequences of all these economic choices.
Well said.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap things up for today. Thanks for joining us for this look ahead at the spring statement. We've covered a lot, explored some potential scenarios, and hopefully given everyone some food for thought as we wait to hear what Chancellor Reeves has to say on March 26th.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, the spring statement is just the start of the conversation. Once those announcements are made, the real work begins. We have to analyze the details, understand the implications, and hold the government accountable for delivering on those promises.
Exactly. Stay informed, stay engaged. Let's see what the future holds for the UK economy and for all of us.
Until next time.